Rich Mogull is a, also a serial forward CloudSec speaker. And oops, we can't do this without our sponsors. And I forget which sponsor I'm supposed to mention. Oh, of course. And all of our sponsors make this happen, but in particular, we want to thank TraceBit, a silver sponsor, who, yes, has also been with us for a while. So anyway, without further ado, Rich.
Thank you, Chris. So you had a wonderful presentation on IAM, a lot of interesting technical information. You had a great presentation on security research. Now I'm going to call this nap time, because I'm going to talk about compliance. My name's Rich Mogull. This is actually my first presentation as Chief Analyst at the Cloud Security Alliance. So I haven't even officially started there, but they agreed to pay for my flight. So yeah, I'm not going to complain yet. And we're going to be talking about dealing with EU compliance-related issues. I'm going to bounce my slides a little bit. I had changed the order of them, and we had problems with my display. The thing is this is a security practitioner conference. All right, how many auditors do we have in the room? Good, because I like to describe auditors as accountants without personalities. This presentation is not for you. This is for the practitioners in the audience. And we also need to acknowledge that I'm an American who flew on an airplane to talk to Europeans about European compliance and regulations. That's not irony, but it does say something about the judgment of the conference selection committee for this particular presentation. Especially because they let me use AI for this, and I had fixed this on my slides that weren't working. That's supposed to say GDPR, not GDR, considering where I'm currently presenting from. And I didn't catch that on my first round of edits. Now that said, I have a long history in working as a security practitioner, 25 years in security, 15 years in cloud security, and I have done some extensive work in Europe, including doing work with the European Commission and around compliance frameworks and cloud maturity. And the problem that we have as cloud security practitioners, as opposed to the auditors, is at the end of the day, it's going to be our fault. We are the ones responsible for securing the organization. And the problem is compliance doesn't really help us be secure. It's just a way of assigning different levels of accountability. And right now, there's a really fascinating combination of forces that are significantly impacting practitioners here in the EU around compliance. Mostly the EU. So those of you not in the EU, you can go get coffee, because I have no idea about your regulations. It's a really messy situation right now, because there are multiple highly impactful regulations that are hitting at the same time, and they're all starting to affect cloud in ways that are more direct than they have previously. At the same time, we are all running on hyperscale cloud providers based in the United States, which is not overly stable in terms of the political situation at this point. And there's a regulation there that regulates US providers, and we'll talk more about the Cloud Act, that can affect the ability to keep data private. The member states are all over the place. Frameworks haven't caught up to regulations. And in fact, the regulations themselves don't necessarily specify what frameworks that you have to use to achieve your compliance. They're descriptive, they're not prescriptive. Right now, we have the 27 member states. There's more than 5 major regulations either in existence or coming, all of which that affect cloud. And half of the member states have missed their own deadlines, particularly with NIS2, in terms of defining how they are going to assess and enforce the compliance with these regulations. And then we don't really have any good cloud security frameworks that have been designed to get us through all of this. So it's a bad situation, because we're being asked, I talk with Chris all the time, who is working over here, and you have to be compliant with these in various ways, or you have to answer to your executives, and you have to do it for multiple regulations all at the same time. And cloud is definitively in the crosshairs. So when I look across these regulations, we are seeing certain consistencies in terms of, even though they're regulating different sectors or they're overlapping sectors or they have different requirements. One of the biggest ones that's affected us is that cloud is now considered a critical part of the software supply chain. And almost every one of these regulations regulates either where you're allowed to put your data in terms of sovereignty, which is down there on the bottom left, the image over there, as well as the ensuring that you understand where that data is stored, how that data is processed, and that you have risk assessments around those supply chains. Now, one of the things of having worked in security for 25 years, when we went from almost no regulations to various dispersed global regulations, and I've worked a lot, particularly with some of the global financials around these issues, is that I'm always looking for consistencies. What are the consistent aspects of these regulations that I, as a practitioner, can leverage to get myself as compliant as possible across all of them? Because then all you need to focus on is what are the differences between those regulations, which should be a much smaller gap that we need to assess as we deal with all of these. But going back into what we see, particularly with DORA and NIS2, there's more requirements around incident response, more around the software supply chain, greater management accountability, which is good because we shouldn't be management, hopefully, blame somebody else, more on resilience and more on the data sovereignty. And then we have weird requirements, like NIS2 is saying you have to use state-of-the-art security. That's wonderful. 80% of breaches are like stored credentials. We don't even have the basics yet, and we're being asked to, and this is across all of the various threat reports out there, and we're being asked to go ahead and use state-of-the-art and new security and emerging technologies, which we still have to get a handle on, and bring their own software supply chain issues. So what do we do? And what do we do as cloud security practitioners? Well, we need to work off of, or we need to have cloud-specific guidance in order to measure and monitor our programs. And this is an area that's been a really big pet peeve of mine for a number of years in the cloud area. What we see is that most of the time we're being told to use things like ISO 27001. That's the most common framework that's being referenced in terms of what you can do to be compliant with NIS2. Well, okay. Last time that was updated was in 2022, and all they did was add a little bit of like a couple requirements around cloud that are not prescriptive and not helpful. And the rest of that framework is everything around human resources and data center security and bring your own devices, all of these other areas. And yet there's like little lines like your cloud service provider should use encryption. Well, that doesn't help us prevent breaches at all in the slightest. Go read Chris's blog post around encryption from 37 years ago. He's old. And then we have, we have 27017. That's the cloud add-on that we're supposed to use for these. That's from 2015 was the last time that was updated. That's when cloud meant virtualization or virtualization meant cloud. Like 10 years ago was the last time that was updated. We do have C5, which gets us a little bit better. Secnum Cloud, which is like out of France, which says there's requirements in there that you have to use sovereign clouds, which has to be can be owned by no more than 39% of foreign company, which I don't know. Okay, so we can't use Amazon, Azure, Google, or any of the other major providers. And so we really struggle. We don't have these frameworks that we need. So that's a lot of chaos. We have multiple overlapping regulations hitting different sectors, new regulations coming, inconsistent enforcement across all of the different member states. We have problems with US access and cloud providers, and we don't have any good frameworks to guide us. So what the hell do we do? Well, I don't want to oversimplify, but these are techniques that I have found to be most helpful. I've worked on these as I've advised various organizations over the years, and the objective is let's organize ourselves to be more secure, but the big thing with compliance, to help us on that compliance side, is do good security and just document it in a way that auditors can understand. That usually involves spreadsheets filled in with crayons. It's the most effective way to appeal to them. To start with, we're going to talk about building a cloud provider registry and then a cloud deployment registry, and understanding how we use this to meet the risk assessment and the supply chain requirements that we see that are pretty consistent, especially in both DORA and in NIS2. And understand, I'm using those synonymously, but they are different regulations. DORA around financial services and organizations that provide services to financial services. And then NIS2, which is like critical sectors, but those critical sectors, there's a based on size, based on the industry you're in, and that kind of changes over time, and they have shifting timelines. All of that said, this advice is going to focus on things that will work across that spectrum, and obviously GDPR, which we've been dealing with for a much longer period of time. Then we're going to get into the governance hierarchy, which is a way that, and I'll get into more of the specifics of that in the 10 minutes that I've got left here. The start to all of this is something that I don't see a lot of organizations implementing, but it is incredibly helpful. There's two different registries that I recommend. The first is that we have something called the Cloud Deployment Registry, or sorry, the Cloud Provider Registry. And the idea is that we have a spreadsheet, which cloud providers are approved, does it meet our risk requirements, what data is allowed to be used there, and do we have any other notes, such as, well, we're going to use AWS, and if it's going to be financial data or PII or health data, that we're only going to use the EU sovereign region, which I'll get into digital sovereignty in the shell game, because it's all just like, yeah, anyway, I'll get there. So, and we list out the providers. Now, I've done, obviously, the hyperscales, mostly focusing in here, but there's so many other smaller providers. What is the purpose of this? This is your documentation that you have met the risk assessment requirements that every one of these regulations has. That you have assessed the risk of that provider, and that you have basically, we sometimes call this the authority to operate, that you allow the teams to use it in a particular way. So it's putting that level of documentation in place. Who can we use with what data are we allowed to use it? The determination that we've done. These requirements don't say you have to be perfect at your risk assessment. They just say you have to do it and you have to document it. Next is the deployment registry. These are the specific application stacks and then where we have deployed them, which cloud provider, who owns it, who's the technical contact and lead for it. This leads into two things. One is also the risk assessment. We know where that data is, how it's being used, so that can help us with those sovereignty requirements for that particular application. And then the other big piece of that is this is critical for incident response. So like I teach cloud incident response at Black Hat. I'm much happier doing the hands-on technical things than this compliancy nonsense, checking boxes on spreadsheets. But the reality is that you need to know where that data is, who's responsible, and you feed this into that incident response process that you can show that you've got meet those timely requirements. And the requirements generally are about detecting, responding to the incident, but also making sure you report it properly. And so this gets you who is the business owner, who are the technical leads, so you can meet that. So those two registries are really important for knowing where everything is, for meeting those requirements that we have around performing the risk assessments and understanding more of the data sovereignty. And I only have 20 minutes, which is why we're going through this really quickly. The next is something that I call the governance hierarchy. I originally wrote this up. It was just based on practical work I'd been doing with a lot of enterprises. It made its way into a lot of the Cloud Security Alliance work, even long before I was employed there. And the idea with the governance hierarchy is that we put a hierarchy of tools in place so that we understand what our requirements are from both the high-level compliance and how we structure our program down to the individual technical security controls on each cloud provider that we can assess using tooling like our CSPMs. At the top of it is a cloud security framework. Now, this is an area where we've had the biggest gap. This is a tool that I wrote, the Cloud Security Maturity Model, a couple years ago. Version 2 was actually based on work I did with the European Commission. We advanced it, and then I kind of genericized it for everybody else. And the idea is that this is a cloud-centric framework. These are the buckets for your cloud security controls that are cloud specific, and you're not having to pay attention to things like human resources and bring your own device and facilities access, all the other stuff. Because as cloud security practitioners, we need to know what we need to focus on. And if you look at ISO, and if you look at the older NIS2 documents and the other frameworks in BSI, there's a lot of non-cloud requirements that are in there. And yet if my job is cloud, I need something that tells me, what do I need to do different in cloud security? So that was the idea behind building this, is to give us like a top-level framework for how do we organize the major aspects of our cloud security program. Then we get into cloud security control objectives. A control objective is how we document our desired security outcome. Control objectives are not specific to individual platforms. A control objective is something like all human access should be using single sign-on with JIT to tie in earlier to the work that Brandon was talking about. That's something that we can document. Then, and if you think about his presentation, he talked about how to do that within AWS and how to do that within Google, and we'll get to that. That's the specifications of how you actually do it at a technology level. Now, why are control objectives so important? This is how we know we're doing all of the things, and these are what we map to compliance. So, look, I shouldn't say bad things about CSA because they paid for my flight and apparently are going to give me health care and allow me to send my children to college here pretty soon. But the CCM is one of the better tools out there, but it still has a lot of gaps. It doesn't get down to always the level of detail that I would like. But I have used the CCM with multiple, really big companies. I take the CCM, I break everything out into separate tabs, like we have on the maturity model. I start breaking out the CCM control objectives, and then I either add to them or rewrite them to get to the point where I need to be with my control objectives. Now, why do I still use the CCM if I think it's imperfect? Well, one, it's a great starting point, but the other is the CCM has mappings to all these regulatory frameworks. So you'll have a control objective in the CCM, and it will tell you which ISO 27001 requirements or 27017 requirements you're hitting. So what we've done with our control objectives is we have mapping of this is what we want to do for security, and this is what compliance requirements that's going to hit. And what you do is over time, when the next compliance requirement hits, you add a column. And that column is where you put in, well, we meet this requirement, and this requirement, and this requirement, and this requirement. So it gives you that mapping in a more practical way. And so you start with, like the CCM. I don't know anything else like it, so that's where I'm always recommending we start, especially for cloud. And then you can customize your objectives and get those down to the next level that meets your organization. I had one, it was a big bank I did this work with. I spent a year on the project, and they wanted to meet FedRAMP. FedRAMP is really weird. It's for government federal contractors, which they were not. But for whatever reason, they decided, well, we're a bank, we want to be FedRAMP compliant. Okay, so all we did is I took all my same normal control objectives I always write out, and I just mapped to which FedRAMP stuff that those are going to hit. Then we get to the part that we all care about, which is control specifications. How am I doing this in AWS? How am I doing this in Azure? How am I doing this in Google? That is the specific technical requirements. And typically, there will be a one-to-many mapping. One control objective will have multiple control specifications. And the specifications are exactly how you're going to do it in that cloud provider, and ideally can map into what you are automatically assessing with your CSPM, your CNAP, your custom tooling, whatever it is you have there. This is where you get to be as auditable and as automated as possible. Can't always fully automate everything, but you do get as close as that, you want to get as close as you can get to it. And this is intimidating because there's hundreds of services on the hyperscale providers. But the way that I've done this in a practical standpoint is you kind of know you're probably only using a core set for most of what you're doing as an organization. And you build that out, and then you add to it over time. And this is where, look, if I'm using something like Wiz or Prisma or whatever else, I'm not just taking what that spits out and their critical lows and highs and whether it matters or not blindly. I look at those, I'm a professional, I know what those mean, and I can select the ones that I want. But they do have their own compliance dashboards. So just rip all of that stuff out of there and start knocking in here. But when you do that, use your brain so that it is, that you've used your assessment as a professional instead of just letting a tool drive that. Then we want to prioritize what we're doing for the regulatory areas that you are dealing with here in the EU. Big ones are cloud as a supply chain, and a lot of that is around your provider risk and your deployment risk. And you can't just jump into a provider and use it without having that risk assessment, particularly if it's any of the regulated data, which is going to be around PII and those kinds of things. Then you want to make sure your defenses align with threats. That's kind of in there in some of these regulations. So keep up to date on the threat reports. Honestly, if you just don't have static credentials and you don't make crap public, you're probably going to be okay, because that's like all of what we're dealing with here, not some of the more advanced stuff. You need to make sure that you have processes for reporting your incidents, so have that documented in your incident response tab, because there's reporting requirements. Major incidents need to be reported within 48 or 72 hours, depending on where you are or what those are going to be. There's some resilience requirements, particularly more on the DORA side than the NIS2 side. Again, that's just going to be documenting your backup and your recovery, as well as your defenses. Your incident response is all part of resilience as well. And then continuous monitoring, continuous testing. That's why we give those companies our money, and they give us tools, and those things are monitoring everything, and that should meet those requirements there. And so in the end, we have these toolings that we can help as starting points. These are not finishing points. But this is my personal preference. This is completely biased, but I start with the maturity model. Yes, I think it's pretty good because I wrote the damn thing, but it's a good start in terms of how we're going to organize everything. The CCM for our starting point for our control objectives. We use that. And the maturity model, by the way, has about 100+ control objectives as key performance indicators, which you can also use to measure your maturity. So it's actually like I wrote out all the control objectives in there. And then your CSP and the CCM and your CSPM tooling. Now, we have a sovereignty issue, as you know. You can ask me questions about that later. The reality is we don't have answers on sovereign cloud right now. I think AWS is probably getting to be the closest in terms of meeting data sovereignty. We know that ECA has been stalled completely because of the sovereignty discussions. That's one of the reasons that framework, there's no European framework for all of this. You have BSI, you've got SecNum Cloud, you've got ISO in use, and there are a lot of sovereignty things. Understand right now, because of the Cloud Act in the US, even if the cloud provider is completely running and only with European employees, the US-based part of the company is required to meet government requests. And take that as you will, we don't have a lot of answers about what the deep implications of that are. And so that's it. I'm slightly over time here, so I'm just going to run through the quick summary and finish it up. But just make sure you're documenting your risk assessments, that you have these interlocking control frameworks with the objectives. It makes it a lot easier if a new compliance regime comes out, if new cloud services come out so you can meet those, because we do know this is not the end. We know that there's other regulations coming, that they're hitting faster, and that they're affecting cloud more frequently. And unfortunately, because my slides didn't work, you don't get the picture of my cat, who is APT1337.
Thank you, Rich. It is exactly 10:45, start of the break. I think we have time maybe for one question. Joel?
Obviously, the different providers are going to be incentivized to make it easier for people to start using them. How much of this is something that providers are able to start building out and giving to customers and making it easier so that customers don't have to do a lot of this reinvention of the same wheel?
So they have a bunch of this already. All the major providers in particular, I looked up Microsoft and Amazon and Google because I don't like Oracle. It's just a Larry Ellison thing. It's like we have a personal beef. And they all have their documentation, particularly around the DORA and NIS2 and GDPR, and they build in compliance stuff. Microsoft has actually been a little better because they have Azure policy that can pre-assess for those things. So they're up to speed. They've got documentation, everything around this, and whatever certifications they can have. And that's honestly why they're building the sovereign clouds, because they know they kind of have to.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.